The design is a sort of flowing, floral, tropical design. Because it's based in central London, the property, I wanted to have birds and flowers and butterflies that look quite tropical but are actually that you would see in the parks or along the Thames.
Welcome back to Artfully Crafted. My name is Alienor, and each week I travel to a craftsperson's studio, interview them and show you their work. This week we're headed to Dorset to meet with stained glass artist Flora Jamieson. I first came across her work on Instagram. I then got to admire her work in person when she took part in a market I organised a while ago. And then more recently I recommended her to a client of mine, and during this video we'll actually be able to see some of the work in progress for that client. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button and let's get into it. Hi Flora.
Hi Alienor.
Thank you so much for having me. We're here in your lovely studio in Bridgeport and we're very lucky with the weather. It's a really nice sunny day and hopefully it helps with stained glass as well. I feel like that's exactly the kind of material that is probably shown off best in the sun.
Yeah,
so.
definitely. No, it makes working on it much easier as well when I've got sort of, nice clear skies to sort of look at work against rather than kind of grey and...
Yeah. Can you sort of explain what kind of work you do? Because I feel like within stained glass a lot of people think about conservation, but that's not the only... There's lots of ways of working with stained glass, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I tend to do more traditional leaded stained glass work, and it's mainly I'm mainly working on new windows but in a traditional style, so it's for sort of period houses, so it might be kind of Victorian front door, or it might be some windows for an arts and crafts era house, so that's the kind of the main sort of work that I do. I tend not to do too much in the way of conservation just because that's not my skill set, although I do work with other stained glass studios, sort of freelance basis, doing painted work for them. So if there's a church window that's been damaged and some of the glass is damaged beyond the point that it could be conserved and sort of saved, then I will get posted, I do it all by sort of mail order.
Yeah.
So they'll post me all the sort of broken pieces of glass and I'll have to kind of assemble it and quite often research, to find out what is missing as well. So that's kind of a case of sort of trawling through the internet, trying to find images of the window before it was damaged. And then paint a copy and then post it back to them.
And there's also ways of being quite contemporary with stained glass, right? Because I think, again, a lot of people sort of think historic, sort of very traditional, but contemporary stained glass is also a thing, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I do both. I do traditional work and I also do contemporary work to my own designs, also sort of mid-century modern, that kind of style. I do a bit of that kind of thing. So it just depends on the brief really, and what the clients, what sort of house they have, what sort of taste they have. It kind of keeps things fresh then, because you're coming to it, after doing, if you've done a lot of very detailed traditional work, which is all sort of hand painted and very labour intensive, it's quite nice to then go to a contemporary window, which is much kind of bolder, more graphic, less intricate painting, and it's more about the sort of colours and shapes. And it's quite nice.
A variety in the projects that you do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can you talk us through the different kinds of materials that you use for stained glass?
Yeah, so I use glass, obviously, and there's different types of glass. So there's machine-made glass, which is it usually has a bit of texture on it, and it will come in a sort of very set range of colours. Okay. And then on the other hand, you've got mouth-blown antique glass, which is handmade, where they blow big cylinders of glass and then it's opened out in the kiln to make a sheet of glass. And then that comes in a much wider range of colours. It's much more beautiful, has lovely clarity to it, sometimes has little air bubbles,
right?
Striations.
And it has a sort of like a wobble to the surface as
exactly,
well, right?
Yeah, so then there's those two types of glass, and you would just, depending on the project, would dictate which one you use. And then I use the traditional leaded glass technique, which is where you have strips of lead which have a channel on each side, and you cut the glass to shape, and you build it up and fit the lead around the glass, a bit like doing a giant jigsaw puzzle basically. And then where all the lead meet, you then put a solder joint. And so you sort of create this network of lead with the glass sitting in the channel. And then there's another technique which I don't really do so much, but it tends to be the dominant technique in the US, is copper foil, which is where you cut all the pieces of glass in the same way, but rather than using this lead channel, you literally stick this sort of copper tape around the edge of the glass. And then when you put all the pieces together, each with their individual copper around the edge, you then solder along all the copper seams.
Oh, okay.
So they don't use lead at all, it's just solder and this copper tape. There are some studios that do leaded work in the States, but I think copper foil is definitely a more hobbyist way of doing it, because you can make much smaller pieces with it. You can cut very tiny, intricate bits of glass. If you can reinforce it properly, perhaps it is suitable for large-scale windows, but I think for larger scale windows, I think leaded is better, because you can, you can kind of reinforce it more easily. But copper foil is not something that I know much about, so I could probably be corrected on that.
No, but it's interesting that there's that difference with the US, that there seems to be more sort of copper foil there.
A stained glass window can either be made up of lots of different pieces of different coloured glass cut from individual sheets of coloured glass. So where you're changing the colour of the glass, you're going to have a lead line. And so the lead can sort of form the outline of the shape. So say you're doing, just for example, a sunflower. You're going to have a lead around each individual petal, for example. And you'll have a different colour, obviously you'll have a green stem, so you'd then have a different colour piece of glass, and the lead lines would follow the line of the stem. So that's one way of making a stained glass window. Another way, which is a way that I'm sort of doing more and more, is the sort of Victorian technique, where they would literally just have a grid of clear glass, and on each individual square of glass you paint the design by hand to build up the image. So actually the window is just a grid. Quite simple design in terms of lead work, but then the painting is much more complex and much more detailed. So you'd get a much more kind of realistic representation using that technique, more like a sort of botanical illustration, literally painted onto the glass. Yeah, so I would start with a sketch, the design, which might be just quite a loose kind of, almost just a little scribble, just to kind of get the idea of what's going to go where, get the proportions. Once that's kind of, the rough idea has been approved by the client, I will then draw up a scale design, which is, going to be a bit more detailed and show sort of colour. And then once that's approved, I'll then draw it up full size, which is called a cut line, and draw on any painted details as well. So you have everything on there. You have your sort of lead lines where the lead's going to go. You're going to, the painted details will all be drawn on there. And then from that cut line or cartoon, it's often called, once it's got all the painted details on it as well, then I would start cutting the glass. So you sort of literally lay your glass on top of it and cut it. Obviously glass is transparent, so you can just sort of pop it on top of the plan and see where you're going to cut using a glass cutter. Cut all your glass, and then once you've got your glass pieces cut, you can then start painting the glass. So you're going to be painting each individual piece of glass, and then depending on how detailed the design is and how much kind of colour is needed, it might need to go through the kiln 3, 4, 5 times to build up those layers of detail and shading and texture and colour.
Okay, so that's if you're painting the glass.
Yeah. So if you're doing this sort of grid technique, if you're using bits of coloured glass, and you might be adding a bit of painting on there to give it shading. So say you're doing this mythical sunflower window that we're making, you might add some shading onto the yellow glass to create the petals.
Yes.
Or you might add some veins on the leaves, but the colour's already in the glass. Whereas if you're doing the other method, the sort of Victorian method, where you've got the clear glass, you're going to do the outline in paint, and then you're going to add shading, and then you're going to add the colour as well with the paints. So that's glass enamels and the vitreous enamels, they're called.
Oh, right.
And silver stain, which is a sort of silver compound that you paint onto the glass, and it actually once you fire it in the kiln, it changes the structure of the glass, so that it creates this. It basically literally stains the glass and creates this gorgeous yellow colour. So you can add yellow to glass, you can modify. So say you've got blue glass, you can put silver stain on it to create green areas. So so it's quite you can have a lot of fun. You can kind of play around with all the different techniques within one window, if you like, to achieve the effect you want to achieve.
That must be quite difficult to work with it then, because the colour that you're applying is not what it's going to look like when it's final, right? Yeah. So you have to have the sort of end colour in your head, but that's not what you're seeing as you're doing it.
Yeah, oh absolutely, yeah, that's very much the case, especially with the enamels and the silver stain particularly. You're having to use just your experience basically, and a bit of guesswork and sample testing, making lots of samples in order to have a good idea of what the outcome's going to be.
I was sort of looking at stained glass in the UK and sort of the different ways of learning stained glass. And there didn't seem to be like a really obvious, I mean, I'm sure back in the days it was sort of like join a big stained glass studio, become an apprentice, etc. But I was sort of wondering how you got into it. Like, what is your background?
Yeah, so I didn't do stained glass straight out of school. I did do art up to A level, but then kind of felt that maybe, I don't know, I wasn't quite good enough, or it wasn't something I was encouraged to carry on with. So I did a degree in media studies, because that was something else I was interested in. I was interested in sort of communication and journalism and that side of things. Then when I came out of university and got my first sort of job, within a few years I realised I was missing working with my hands. And actually one of the jobs I had was working for Madame Tussauds in their studio where they make the waxworks, which is a really fascinating place to work. And there was people there with all sorts of amazing skills. There were people there who were doing sort of inserting the hair strand by strand. There's sculptors, there was costume makers, incredible kind of collection of artists and skilled craftspeople in there. And it made me think, actually, maybe art isn't what I want. Maybe I want craft, maybe I want to be a maker. And I kind of landed upon stained glass just by chance, really. Just saw it in a book and thought, that looks interesting. So signed up and did an evening class and really enjoyed that. And then signed up for a 1-year course while I was still working, and just was doing like a part-time course.
Yeah.
And then once I'd done that, I kind of looked around for a studio that might take me on as a kind of informal apprenticeship. So then I found a studio in London who I started working on Saturdays, unpaid, and then it was kind of 1 day a week, and then it was 3 days a week, and then eventually I was full-time. And then I sort of basically learnt on the job. They were a professional studio, so I got taught a very different way to the way I'd learnt at college. It was kind of a much more
professional way, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it was more like a trade, Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess traditionally that's how most people would learn, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly,
the idea of doing a degree for everything is quite a modern idea in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And there really aren't that many opportunities for learning stained glass any other way now. I think there's very few degree level courses. In fact, I don't think there's any sort of BA level stained glass courses now in the UK. Okay. I think there's a couple of masters you can do. There's one in York and one at Swansea. The one in York is mainly I think it's entirely conservation. I think the one in Swansea is kind of a bit more architectural, conceptual kind of glass. So I think
it wouldn't really prepare you for the kind of work that you're doing.
No,
in a way.
Absolutely not. I think the only way really to do it is to find someone who will mentor you. I mean, there aren't even any big studios anymore that take on apprentices. There's a few, but not many. So you have to sort of bootstrap it a bit.
In a way, like the weight is on that person who wants for training to then find, okay, I'm going to do a week with this person, a week with this person, I'm going to do this short course, which is trickier for them rather than them having the opportunity to approach this one large studio and say, oh, I'm going to be apprentice to you for 5 years and over time you'll have the opportunity to teach me everything.
Yes.
Like that's not, you have to be, as you say, quite hungry to learn and very proactive.
Yeah, definitely. That's one good thing that's come out of social media is that it's never been easier to sort of access artists and craftspeople and sort of contact them and say, would you mind if I came and shadowed you for a day? Could you advise me on that? I mean, obviously you don't want a deluge of people asking you questions all the time, but if someone has a specific issue that they're like, oh, I'm trying to get this colour in the glass, but I've done all these tests and nothing's working, is there anything you can suggest? I don't mind asking if people ask me a very specific question that they're really struggling with. Obviously you can't, as an artist you just wouldn't have enough time to sort of give someone all the information they need to become a stained glass artist via Instagram messaging.
Yes, I guess so thinking about people who might want to get into stained glass, I think I'm aware of There's one course at Morley College, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of, any short courses or online courses?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few stained glass artists who teach, short courses and weekend courses as part of their practice. So there's definitely opportunities for short courses. Mm-hmm. And I think, not all stained glass courses are created equal. Some are better than others. And it depends what you want from it. If you just want to do it just as a hobby and just as a bit of fun, there's definitely courses at that level. If you want to do something where you're sort of doing a few more techniques, where you're learning a bit of glass painting and silver staining and all that kind of stuff, there are glass artists out there who teach, more in-depth and thorough courses. So there's opportunities to learn. It's just a case, like you say, you have to be quite resourceful and seek out those courses and get advice about like which course would be right for the level that you want to work at. Mm-hmm. There's also a few online courses. I've got an online course with a platform called Domestica, which is a sort of beginner's stained glass course to the leaded technique. And I think that's really useful actually, an online course. Although it seems, you think, how could you possibly do an online course in something like stained glass where you need a studio and you need equipment and machinery and tools and glass and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's really useful if you just want to see if stained glass is right for you, to actually look at, how would you set up a studio? How would you, what tools do you need? And then how do you actually make a stained glass window? So at a very low entry point in terms of price, without investing in, hundreds and hundreds of pounds into a, even just a weekend course is a few £100s. For £20 or however much it changes the price that it's on at all the time, because it's on a sort of dynamic pricing thing, but generally it's around £10 to £20. You can have a really good overview of what being a stained glass artist looks like, and you can decide whether you want to invest more in that. And if you've already got a few tools and you've got an outbuilding you can use as a workshop, then you could totally, use an online course to get you started, for sure.
And in terms of like setting up your business, do you feel like studying, what you did originally, media studies, do you feel like that's sort of like been helpful in a way? Because you said like it's like journalism and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, I think it has been helpful actually, although I didn't really expect it to. But when you run a business, you do have to market yourself, in order for people to get to know who you are. And I think you have to be quite public facing as a maker. So you end up doing your own social media, doing your own marketing, doing interviews like this. So you actually that sort of whole communication side of my degree has become, I mean, not that, it was obviously a long time ago. There's not anything really specifically that I learnt there that I'm drawing on, but I think it's a confidence at sort of presenting yourself and communicating and, marketing yourself. If you haven't got regular work coming in, you can't run a business. And so the only way to get regular work coming in is just to be out there, promoting yourself, which is, it's not always what you feel like doing. No. Sometimes you just want to be on the workbench making the windows. But
yeah, totally. But I think that's something that's come up again and again, and which I was expecting a little bit, but I've been surprised by how much time people actually spend on the business side of things. When you're sharing your work on Instagram, etc., like people might underestimate just how much of your time is actually not spent being creative.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I've started actually partly because I had so much work on and I had lots of smaller freelance jobs mixed in with bigger projects. And in order to get everything done, I've started getting in the workshop really early at sort of 6 a.m.
Wow.
Before anyone else is up, before the emails start coming in. Just do 2 hours from 6 till 8. And it's such productive time. And I can really kind of get through the smaller jobs just by doing that. And then it frees me up in the day to work on the bigger jobs and also to do the sort of running of the business, the emailing and the, just ordering materials in, site visits, all that other side of stuff, which isn't actually making. Like you say, exactly, a good day's making is probably 3 to 4 hours.
So how long are your days then? Are you starting at 6 but also finishing earlier, or are you actually just...
I finish at 6.
You work 12 hours?
Well, I mean, I do get a lunch break, and I like literally my house is next door, so I do get, coffee breaks are plentiful.
Fine.
But yeah, no, it's a long day, but I've just got used to it because it's the only way I can get everything done in the day that I need to do.
Yeah, and you're so good at communicating and marketing. You've got a wait list.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first year I've had a waiting list, actually. Normally I kind of have a sort of 6 months work.
Any longer than you have that,
plus people that I've sort of said I really can't take on any more work at the moment, but I'd be happy to contact you in a few months' time when things are a bit quieter. So yeah, so that's a great position to be in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so now that you're at that stage of your career where clearly your work is in high demand, how do you regard pricing? Do you feel like you've sort of nailed it?
I think there's always, improvements to be made. I definitely feel like I'm better at pricing now than I used to be. I think when I first started, I just used to think, well, how long is that going to take me? Okay, and what's my hourly rate, and what are the materials going to cost? And then that would be my price. But really, it's not the same as working for a business. I'm not an employee, I am the business. So I need to cover all my other costs of when I'm not actually physically making the window. I need to cover the costs of the overheads of the studio and doing site visits and buying materials and doing my admin and doing my emails, doing my accounts, all that sort of stuff which isn't actually making a window. That all needs to be accounted for. So I have to be so much better, I have to charge so much more than just the hourly rate of actual making the window. Because
every project has to contribute to that overall running of the studio, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I also need to think, well, I might need to buy new equipment soon, I might need to buy a new kiln, or I might need to buy a new light box, or so I need to make sure that I've got enough, profits coming in to invest in the business as well. So it's all, and that's all a learning curve that, nobody taught me that. It's just trial and error and
yeah, totally.
Yeah, when I was pricing my work, like I used to sort of think, oh, I can't charge that much. That seems like a lot. But I heard it. It was a quote that I heard from somebody, and it really stuck with me, which was, "It's not my job to think about what other people might like to pay for my work. My job is to price it so that I am fairly compensated for the hours and the materials and the overheads and everything. And what they want to pay for my work is none of my business." Do you know what I mean? Like, it's really not my business.
Yeah, that's so true.
And so I just need to just do my side. Don't overthink it. Don't think about, oh, that seems like a lot, or that's not enough, or whatever. It's just be very, very practical about, like, what actually do I need to charge in order to run my business. And that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good, I think that's a good guideline, actually.
Yeah. It's tricky because, I'm not my client. I'm not the sort of person I'm not able to go out and buy my work. Like, I haven't. That's not where I'm at. But there's plenty of people who are in that place, and they want to invest in, which is actually one of the nicest things, is when you meet people who really want to invest their time and their money in artists and creatives, and it almost feels like the old sort of patronage system, which is wonderful. I'm very privileged to have some lovely clients who are, who really do invest their time and their money in my work, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and actually, so my next question was going to be, to kind of talk through the commissioning process, and we wanted to use as an example a client that I introduced you to, and we were talking about them and saying, well, actually, that feels that sort of like tradition of patronage. They're really supportive, and so maybe using their project as a sort of case study. Can you talk us through what the commissioning process is like?
Yeah, so she approached me. It's for her house, and she wanted some stained glass. So one of the windows I'm doing is for a bathroom, and so it's got to be kind of functional as well, because it's a bathroom. So it's screening, it's creating privacy, but it's also kind of connecting the bathroom to other areas of the house with this beautiful. She's got some wonderful de Gournay wallpaper with all the kind of tropical birds and tropical plants. So it's kind of connecting that to what's happening in the bathroom. So the design is a sort of flowing, floral, tropical design. Because it's based in central London, the property, I wanted to have birds and flowers and butterflies that look quite tropical but are actually that you would see in the parks or along the Thames. So I've gone with a sort of overarching magnolia tree, because I always think they look so stunning. And partly, I'm always inspired by what's happening at the time of the year whenever I'm making the commission, because I'm so inspired by nature. So, as I was sort of walking around London after doing the site visit, and there's all these beautiful magnolia trees in bloom, and there's the parakeets, and there's, you know what I mean? There's bits of London that look kind of tropical.
Everywhere. I'll be walking my dog and there's parakeets, and I'm like, what are you doing here?
So that was
such a funny thing.
Yeah, so that was the kind of fun thing to do, to sort of play on, it's London, but also it looks like it could be India or it could be Thailand, this sort of tropical, lush vegetation.
I like that, actually, because isn't the parakeets, that happened during the Victorian period, didn't it? They're not a local species to London, but I think it's in the Victorian Victorian period that they were sort of brought over into, was it Kew Garden or something?
I
And then
think
they
so,
just
yes,
rise and and now they're all over London. But that project that you're doing is sort of based on that very traditional Victorian, you know, as you said, like the glass grid, and then you're painting the glass. So it's kind of nice to have that, you know, the parakeets. And,
that's right. The Victorians were great collectors of specimens as well. You know, they often would, like, you know, bringing back plant specimens and all this kind of, you know. So it's quite nice that's almost the theme of the window, really, is these kind of things that have been collected and brought to London from other places to create this kind of beautiful kind of, I suppose it's like a park or a garden, the design, you know, with a heron. What else is in there? There's some irises, some foxgloves. Yeah. Just all things that are kind of got that sort of lush, splendid, gorgeous, colourful, exactly, yeah. So I did an initial sketch, just a small scale sketch, which was approved, and so then draw up the design full scale as a sort of pencil sketch, because I will use that, I draw it on tracing paper and I'll use that as my sort of template that I'm painting from. So I'll literally put the tracing paper on the light box, put the glass on top of the tracing paper, and then use that as my guide to paint.
And that's then when you do the layers and it goes in the kiln, and then you do the next
that's
layer,
right. So I'll start off doing just sort of kind of a very simple outline, really, which is called the trace line, and that sort of plots out the basics of the design, but there's no sort of shading or colour at this point. It's literally just an outline. And then once I've done that, I mean, there's different ways of working. This is the way I work. Lots of other artists do it. Stained glass artists have a different technique, but this is the one that sort of works for me, that I've, you know, evolved over the years. Yeah. So once I've done that, I'll then do a shading layer, which is usually like a sort of browny black paint. And there's various sort of painting techniques, stippling and scratching out, to get this kind of texture and shading on the glass, to give a sort of 3D quality to the leaves and to the plants and the birds. And then that will get fired again. And then once I've got the shading the way I like it, then it's time to start adding colour, which will be vitreous enamels, which you kind of paint on, and you can blend them so you can get kind of graduations in colour. And then the last firing is the silver stain, which is this kind of yellow silver compound, which I mentioned before. And that, you know, you add that as the final layer, because it's slightly lower firing temperature than the enamels and the paint.
Okay.
And so that's really exciting when you put the silver stain on, because that's almost kind of like, until that point, you can't really tell how it's going to look, and then you add the yellow and it kind of just pops and it brings it to life. It's great.
Oh, amazing. The firing process, that then makes it completely waterproof, the design, right?
Yeah, so that would permanently fuse it to the surface of the glass, and that's the same technique they used, you know, back in the medieval times when they were making church windows, you know.
And you just mentioned, obviously, that nature is a big part of the inspiration for you, and like, do you feel like you draw on the seasons a lot?
Yes, yeah, like I say, I'm really inspired, like, you know, whatever's happening in nature while I'm working on a project, I'll always want to include that, partly because I can actually then study it from life as well, which is always nice. So for example, this one where I've got the magnolia tree. I've got a little magnolia tree out in the garden, so every now and again I have to pop out and just check, like, how is that, you know, where are these little buds coming from, and how does that attach to the flower? And, you know, you can really observe it, which is fantastic. Otherwise I'll use
you've got lots of reference books
so
as
I
well,
use
right?
lots of vintage botanical and sort of bird reference books, and I'm always collecting those. I mean, that's one nice thing about Bridport, is we've got the market and we've got a fantastic selection of like vintage bookshops here as well. So, you know, I'll pop out for a pint of milk and come back with a bird book. And so nature's definitely one of the themes that I like to include, just because I'm sort of fascinated by it. And it kind of, you know, like most people will have a plant or a bird or a tree or something that's symbolic to them. And so I think generally when you're commissioning stained glass, it tends to be, it's a commemorative piece, or it's a celebration of your family, or it's to mask, you know, sometimes stained glass is really functional. It's to mask a boring view. Like if you've got a window looking out onto a brick wall of your neighbour's house opposite, you know, you put a stained glass window there, and then you've got something beautiful to look at.
Glass is quite a temperamental material, and especially when it comes to coloured glass, it's really difficult, isn't it, to get like a consistent colour for the glass, you know, because you might order something and it might not be the colour that you propose to the client, right? Like, does that ever happen?
That does happen, and it is one of the biggest, you know, one of the biggest challenges of being a glass artist is firstly getting hold of materials in the first place, because that's not always straightforward, and obviously where I am, I'm quite remote here, so I have to travel to go and buy and look just to look at the glass and buy it. But yeah, because stained glass is made in batches, and from batch to batch there might be slight variations in colour. So although I might show a client a sample of glass, when the actual glass arrives, it might be slightly darker than sample, or it might have slightly different texture than sample. So that's really difficult. So really, it's a case of sort of making the client aware of the nature of glass, and that this is a possibility that it might not be exactly the same. And I mean, what I've done in the past, especially when I'm working with interior designers, and I'm they're sort of the middleman between me and the client, is I've sent the interior designer the sample, and I said, like, this is roughly what it's going to look like, but when I buy the sheet glass in, I will send you a piece of the actual glass.
I see.
So that way, there's no nasty surprises at the end of the job.
How many manufacturers are there in the world at the moment?
So in terms of mouth-blown glass, in Europe, there's just two, as far as I'm aware. There used to be a third one that was in Poland, we used to make beautiful and very affordable mouth-blown glass, and some really nice, vibrant, bright colours. But they ceased production about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. So that was a real loss to the glass community. We still miss them.
Yeah.
We still hope that somebody will come in and revive it, but it doesn't look that way. So now there's just the two, the one in France, the one in Germany.
Yeah.
And then in the UK, there is English Antique Glass, who I'm not sure if they're still producing sheet glass. They are still making glass, but not sheet glass anymore. And then I think there's a chap called Elliot Walker, who's a glass blower, and I think he's just starting to experiment with making mouth-blown sheet glass. So that's exciting. And hopefully, good things will come from that.
So what are the names of the two European suppliers that you mentioned?
Okay, so there's Lambert's, which are Germany, and Saint-Just in France. And they both make a beautiful glass. So it's, we're very lucky that obviously
that we do have them.
That we do have that, And there's I mean, in terms of people who supply it in the UK, there's only really a couple of glass suppliers who will supply the mouth-blown glass. So it's not always easy to get a hold of. I think, I do know some people who run big studios, and they'll actually just drive to Germany and buy a load of sheets and drive back with them. That's the easiest way to get it.
Yeah. Because Saint-Just, they're actually the ones who did the windows for Notre Dame, right? I think.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
So they do a lot of, both companies, I guess, are really involved with like historical or like heritage glass, right?
Yeah, that's right,
but it's what you were saying is basically there's not a lot in terms of suppliers, and that actually is directly affecting the trade, because actually it's not for lack of artists working in stained glass, it's actually for lack of suppliers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really, it's becoming a real problem actually. Partly why I've started working more in the technique of, sort of painting on clear glass and doing the sort of Victorian style, is because then I've just got to get clear glass that's much easier to get hold of, and then I'm adding all the colour myself. So it makes life, although it's more labour intensive, it sort of solves all the issues of trying to find glass.
Stained glass has entered the Endangered Crafts list, is that right?
So last year it was put on the red list of Endangered Crafts, partly because of difficulty getting hold of glass, but also because of lack of training opportunities. So I think it's quite a good, in a way, sort of being added to that list. It has kind of created a bit more of a revival of people being interested in it, and people thinking about how can we solve these problems. So it has sort of started the conversation, but I think there's a long way to go. I say without big studios that can take on apprenticeships, or it's really hard to kind of filter your way through the system. I mean, there are things. I mean, I've got a girl coming from, or a woman coming for an internship for a week in July, and that's part of a sort of an award that she's doing, where she gets to spend a week in different studios around the UK. You want to, there were people that took me on at the start of my career and gave me an opportunity, and so you do feel like you need to pay it forward and do whatever you can with the limited time and resources that you have.
And that's sponsored by one of the livery companies.
I think so.
Right?
I think it's through the Worship Company of Glaziers.
Yeah, which I think they really do invest so much in crafts, all these livery companies, and often it's not very well it's not a very well-known fact by the general public, but they do quite a lot to support and invest into teaching opportunities. So I've definitely come across, even in carving, etc., people who've said, well, actually part of my training was funded by this and this livery company, which is quite interesting. And so as the sort of last thing, I always love to finish on, what is your dream commission?
Well, I mean, this job that I'm working on at the moment is almost a dream commission, because it's, you know, the subject matter's so lovely. I'm really enjoying working on it. And the client's great. So, you know, it's all, you know, that's actually, you know, absolutely lovely. And then in terms of sort of in the future, I probably would be nice to do something a bit more of a public commission rather than just working for private houses. It would be nice to have something that everybody could, you know, come and enjoy. Would be lovely. Certainly anything with an opportunity to travel is always welcome.
Yeah, of course.
I've done a few projects, you know, in the past. Did a job in Dublin, so that was quite nice. Got to go over there and fit that. I've done work up in Scotland, but I have not done anything anywhere. Oh, you know, I've got a project over in Costa Rica at the moment, so that's quite exotic, but I don't think I'll get to go over there.
Fine.
But yeah, anything that involves travel is good, and also anything that's collaborative. I always really enjoy doing collaborations where you're working with another artist or designer to produce something, and because then it's, you know, it's quite a lonely thing just being a sole maker, and when you've got someone else's input and someone else's design ideas, and you're both pulling together and you're creating something that's completely, you know, unique, because it's two heads rather than one, especially if you're working with an artist who's coming up with ideas from a non-stained glass background. It forces you to have to think quite creatively about how you're going to achieve the effect that you want to achieve. So then that becomes a learning opportunity, because you're then having to do tests and samples to kind of create that effect. So that's always quite enjoyable as well.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. Well, great. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been really great to talk to you, and it's great to, you know, to have the opportunity to, you know, discuss my craft and nerd out about it a bit. It's great.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Flora.
Thank you.
I've linked Flora's website below, and also any other resources, the things that were mentioned during the course of the conversation. If you have any questions for her or about stained glass in general, please leave them below and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you for watching. It means a lot, especially as at the moment this channel is entirely self-funded. So please spread the word. Like, share and subscribe. See you next week.
I'm just trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to talk about, but I don't think there is. I think we've covered pretty much everything, haven't we?
Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, perfect. Now that I'm back on.